For almost 3 years, young women were disappearing in Luoyang, not because they were running away, but because one man was dragging these women into a torture bunker that he had built in his own house. 6 captives, 2 murdered, 4 that were forced to serve him on camera. Nobody knew that they were down there. Nobody even heard them. And the police, they didn't even find this monster. One of the captives were able to escape long enough to report him before being dragged back into that torture bunker. What officers would find when they finally opened that door to that bunker was a thing of nightmares. And that is exactly what makes this case one of the most disturbing in modern Chinese history. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh yeah. If you are new here, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper and I hop on here twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday, and we talk about a true crime case that is keeping us up at night. But with that being said, if true crime is your jam, then I highly suggest that you subscribe, you get the notification bell on because, well, like I said, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. It would also mean the world to me if you could please hype this video up. YouTube did take away that feature on my last video, which rude, YouTube, rude. So it would really mean the world to me if you can donate your hype points to moi and help me grow this channel. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, they will all be found listed down below. My social media handles, products used on my face today, in case you're interested. But I think that's it. So without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the crazy ass case, the disgusting case of Li Hao. Let me tell you, this is yet another one of these cretins that don't have the tragic childhood, that doesn't have a story where the universe says, that's a turning point. That is the beginning of evil. And I'm starting to realise more as we go on that I believe there is genuinely people on this planet who were just born evil. So Li Hao, he was born in February of 1977. The exact date, who knows? Who cares? No me. Now, he was born on the outskirts of Luoyang, which is one of China's sort of like ancient cities. It has dynasties, temples. It's full of people who just want to mind their own business. Now, his family, they were described as being stable. They were working class. It was an unremarkable family in the nicest way possible. I'm not trying to diss like his parents or siblings, but there was nothing special in a bad or good way to really call out. And that's because sometimes, unfortunately, these men and these women, they're just black holes in the human form and we don't really know why. And when he was a child, people would use these very exciting adjectives to describe him. Quiet, average, just there. He wasn't the kind that was a bully. He also wasn't bullied. He wasn't exploding frogs in the playground or worshipping fire or collecting suspicious magazines. Yet, he was just boring. And to be quite honest, that can be one of the darkest truths when it comes to true crime, that sometimes these boring, unremarkable men are the very ones that we should fear the most. Because they seem to sit quietly, they marinate in their own insecurity, just waiting for the day that their insecurities will evolve into something else entirely. Now, by his teen years, Li Hao, he had one defining characteristic that everyone knew him for, and that was being deeply uncomfortable within any social situations, but in particular, any social situations that included females. Later on, former classmates, they would say to investigators that Li Hao was always a person watching from the edge. If group activities were taking place, he was never one to participate. He was the one who always wanted to sit at the side and watch. He lingered like a bad smell. He was always described as a kind of guy that looked like he had something to say, but couldn't bring himself to say it. It was like he was always thinking something that he would never dare tell anyone. Now, after he graduated school, he would drift in and out of small, odd jobs, and every single job he had, he performed with the enthusiasm of a cardboard box. He could never really apply himself, not fully, because he had fantasies that were deeper and darker, and they were the only things that he was actually passionate about. Working an honest job, never heard of it. And eventually, he did end up working as a junior fire safety inspector, and this was something that finally gave him a little bit of the things that he was craving. Now, the first one was a title that made him feel more important than what he actually was. And the second was access to buildings, construction sites, and also structural plans. And this is knowledge that, in hindsight, should be enough to make everyone's skin crawl because there was a reason he wanted this type of work. There was a reason he wanted this type of access. And it was this period where Li Hao, he starts to cultivate these small seeds of dominance that would later bloom into this full-scale captivity fantasy. And at this very time is when he starts to consume violent pornography, BDSM, and obscure online stories about confinement, about women who are trapped against their will. And the thing is, in China, they heavily restrict this kind of content. So if you're going to view it, you're surfing the web with intention because it is not easy to come across. But Li Hao, he was nothing but motivated when it came to feeding his sick, depraved fantasies. And he wasn't browsing out of curiosity or morbid curiosity, he was researching. This was his version of studying. He was learning how control worked, how fear worked, and also how isolation worked. Now, when it came to his dating life, it didn't exist. And I don't mean like it barely existed or he had like one or two dates but creeped the women out. I mean like point blank, wasn't there. No one wanted to date this man, and that is because he had the social presence of a fart in a spacesuit. No one wanted to be trapped in a small room with him. Co-workers said that he was stiff, he was pedantic, and he was very quick to irritability or anger, especially when someone disagreed with him, when someone challenged him, and more importantly, when that someone was female. Li Hao said that he craved control in this element of his life because he didn't have any in his day-to-day life, and he resented every single person who made him feel small, not realising that there was a reason these people avoided him, there was a reason he received constant reject, and that is because he was a frickin' weirdo and people seen through it. Now, around 2007 to 2008, he became obsessed with the psychology of obedience. He started becoming obsessed and reading up on persuasion, hypnosis, fear conditioning, and breaking resistance. And unlike many of us who would probably go down a rabbit hole researching this to profile, or at least do our version of profiling these weirdos, this for him wasn't an internet rabbit hole. It was his manual for domination. Then Lee decides he's going to switch things up a bit. He's going to get outside, and this should be a great thing. Be at one with nature, smell the fresh air, sniff a flower or two. But he decided he was going to go to nightclubs, and this wasn't to socialise, it wasn't to let his hair down, try and pick up a lady. This was very much so he could observe. He didn't go there to drink, he didn't go there to party or to dance. He would sit in the corner in complete silence and just watch people. Someone actually described him as looking like a security guard that hadn't been hired by anyone. Just a weirdo in the corner. And the thing is, doing this at a nightclub, an environment that is loud, is sociable, he was noticed. He thought he wouldn't be because it is such a loud environment, but when you stick out like a sore thumb, people take note. But that didn't matter to him because he was there to analyse, to watch how women behaved, to watch how much they drank, to see who looked the most vulnerable, who left alone, how long did it take them to walk from the club to their house? Did they walk with someone else? Which routes did they take? Did they ever switch it up? This man was mapping vulnerability the way other people map bus routes. From there, it would be some point in 2008 when this man decides he is going to build his own underground prison. Those BDSM and domination content that he's watching, he's going to recreate it. He's going to live that life for himself. Now, another thing to know about Li Hao is whilst he was consuming this domination BDSM content, he was becoming obsessed with pornography in general, and not in the sexual manner, but he realised just how much money could be made off websites like this. And to him, that meant that there was an opening opportunity, a way that he could earn money if only he had women, actresses, to perform for him. And instead of trying to go down the honest route, instead of trying to get contacts and find people who could help him do this consensually, this man, because he has the emotional maturity of a frickin' stapler, decides that he's going to do it in the most depraved ways possible. And thanks to his fire department job, he knew what areas of the city had lax inspections, which neighbourhoods had older houses with unmonitored basements. He also knew what kind of landlords would rent to anyone who paid cash that wouldn't ask questions. And after months and months of searching, trying to find his perfect prison, he eventually finds one in Baiyuan district. This was a modern home, it had an unfinished basement, the neighbourhood was quite quiet, they kept to themselves, and the landlord, he lived far enough away that he wasn't just going to be turning up for random inspections. It was perfect for Li. He knew this was a kind of place where he could operate exactly how he wanted, and no one would bat an eye because no one was paying attention. So by early 2009, he was now renting this home from the landlord. When the landlord asked a brief question of, so what's your plans? Like, what are you planning on doing with this? Are you going to fix it up? Are you moving in? Do you have a family? Do you have a wife? We'll crack the jokes, Mr. Landlord. Does this freak show have a wife? Of course not. But Li Hao tells him that he needs this place for storage. He's got his own home, he's got his own life going on, but there's just not enough room in the house to store his goods. So this weirdo, he starts construction on the house, and it started quietly, it started pathetically. He was digging during the night, he was moving small bags of soil at a time, so no one could really tell what was going on. He started to reinforce the walls with construction materials that he had either bought or borrowed, aka stole, from his job. He had also learned how to create sound dampening by layering different materials together. He was installing ventilation tubes under the guise of them being air filters. And when it came to spacing out his prison, he didn't have just one open space, one chamber for one woman. He would create multiple chambers. The plan all along was to have at least 6 women within his prison at any given time. He had divided these spaces so these women, whilst they are trapped in the same area, they would still live in isolation. And let's be real here, this isn't some mad genius at work. This is an emotionally insecure man with too much time in his hands, too many insecurities, and just enough knowledge that he can be a bit dangerous. Like I said earlier, this is a man who, when he wants what he wants, he's motivated. He would stick at this longer than he stuck at any of his jobs, because creating this prison, these chambers, it would take over a year. Over a year of him doing all this work himself, digging tunnels, building walls, reconstructing, soundproofing where he could. And the entire time he was fantasizing, he was obsessing. And when that dungeon was finally complete, he could move on to phase 2, the part that seemed to excite him the most. And this is when he would start studying women that could be his potential victims. He would stalk nightclubs. He was watching the hostesses to see how they interacted with customers. Were they good dancers? Did they work late nights? Did they live in dormitories far away from their work? And this man, he wasn't going after the woman he thought was the most beautiful, the one who, tickled his pickle the most. It was all about predictability, perceived vulnerability. He wanted someone that he knew their routine to a T, and he could take them. Now, don't get me wrong, every single one of these women are beautiful, absolutely. But all I'm saying is that he wasn't seeing them for their beauty. He was seeing them as who would be the easiest opportunity in his eyes. And not only was he watching them and stalking them from a distance, some nights he was actually following them home. He was timing how long it took them to get from the club to their homes, or tracking who walked through the streets that were the darkest, which women took paths that were more isolated, that were quieter, which women lived in areas that were far less patrolled. And that is how he would target his victims. So by late August of 2009, Li Hao, he had finally chosen his first victim. He had watched her leave work at the same time nearly every single night. He followed her at a distance. He had studied when she was walking home roughly how many cars would pass by. He took these numbers and built an average from them, calculating how many pedestrians used the same route at these times. Everything was catalogued with him. Everything was meticulous. He was so desperate, so insecurely desperate to get himself a woman that he could trap against her will. By the end of September, this man knew this woman's route far better than she did. Now, before I dive into the victims of this case, I do need to put in a quick disclaimer here that due to Chinese privacy laws, when it comes to cases like this that are very sensitive in nature, victims' full legal names have never been released. Now, some victims are known by their initials, some are known by their surnames, and others are known by aliases. So when I'm talking about these victims, I will use the alias or surname or initial that was provided to them. They reflect the very limited information that is available on this case from court documents and also verified reporting. Whilst these women's names might remain unknown and protected, their voices and their stories deserve to be heard. Everything in this case begins with a young woman by the name of Zhang. She had been abducted in the early hours of October the 1st of 2009. This woman had been lured into his bunker under false pretenses. She thought there was going to be some kind of work opportunity, but as soon as she got in there, she realised that something nefarious was going on, something really sinister. She entered this bunker alive and resistant, and she was determined to not let this weaselly little man dominate her. For several days, this woman was enduring beatings, starvation, dehydration, constant surveillance, and his attempts to force her into sexual compliance. And this woman, Zhang, she refused every single bit of it. She took whatever this man threw at her because she was just completely unwilling to give in to his demands. She was the only captive that Li Hao had at this time, but still her resistance to this little man was enough to make him feel humiliated. Bearing in mind the only witness to this was him and Zhang. That is how insecure this little man was. Her refusal to comply exposed the fragility of his control. But because Li Hao was the kind of cretin that turned humiliation into homicidal rage, he decided he would beat Zhang to death. This was prolonged, it was torturous, it was absolutely vile. And when he was done, he just buried her under the soil in this chamber like she meant nothing. And he really truly thought that he was getting the last laugh. He felt like he had won, that he was invincible. But Zhang and her ability to refuse this man, this obviously scarred him. It left him with a fear that he might come across another uncontrollable woman. And for nearly a year, he was terrified to try and abduct anyone else. But by mid to late 2010, that uncontrollable urge that he had resurfaced. He decided it was time to try again. And it's so eerie, but the second woman that he would abduct was also a young woman by the name of Zhang. But this Zhang, she was younger. She was barely out of adolescence. She was working as a nightclub hostess, she was new to the city, and she was financially vulnerable. And another thing that made her vulnerable was that every single night, she walked home alone, and it was around a time where no one else was really present. And this to Li Hao made her the perfect victim, the perfect target, because he didn't have to worry about anyone else fighting her corner. And because she was younger, he believed that she was a woman or young girl that he could overpower easily. So see how it's shifting, how he's having to go for the younger, more vulnerable, because he's scared that he might get overpowered, that he might get met with the same refusal as his first victim. He's pathetic. When this young woman was dragged forcefully into this bunker, she would be put in the same chamber that the first Zhang had died in. Now, of course, at this point, she doesn't know the details. She doesn't know what took place, what happened. She didn't know that someone else had died. But she immediately sensed that something was off. She could feel danger rush through her body, and immediately she thought to herself, compliance is going to be my best friend. Compliance is how I will get out of here alive. Now, this wasn't agreement, it wasn't submission, this was strategic obedience. And while she is going along with this strategic obedience, she very quickly identifies that Li Hao, he's someone that feeds on reactions. If she argued with him, if she fought back, he swelled in aggression. Because this insecure little man, like I said, he cannot stand his authority being questioned. Remember, this is the only way he's ever been able to get a woman. So when they question him, when they humiliate him, this makes him angry. But if she placated, if she softened, he also softened. This young woman adapted because her survival depended on it. Within days, this young woman was being used at this evil man's disposal. He was raping her. He was forcing her to have sex with paying clients. Not only that, but he was filming all of this. He was making homemade pornography. He was also setting up video calls. Like I said, he's trying to set up his own pornography website because he believes this is what's going to get him the most money and build him this high-flying career of being a frickin' asswipe. But he was charging men 500 yen for 30 minutes on call with this young woman. And this loser, he is playing director. He is honestly behind the camera, which, by the way, the quality was he filming on his frickin' toaster or a potato, because what's going on there? But he was acting as though he was shooting this big movie and this was his Oscar-winning scene. And as these weeks were turning into months, his cruelty just expanded. If she refused to have sex with a paying client, if she refused to comply on camera, he would beat her. He would starve her. He was threatening to kill her. And yet, even in these periods of being completely terrified and wondering what would happen to her, she was still studying this man. She started to notice mistakes that he was making, slips in his pattern. For instance, the upstairs keys. Sometimes he was leaving them hanging downstairs in the chamber when he would get distracted. She also noticed that his routines were very sloppy. There was never a set routine. Sometimes he would visit the bunker 3 times in one night. Sometimes he would visit once during the day. And she noticed that he would always make himself a tea before coming downstairs. And the thing is, what might sound to us like trivial observations right now, these are actually the very building blocks that would lead to this man's downfall. After a period of time, Li Hao decides that he's ready for his second captive. At this point, he really believes that he's perfected his system, whilst not realising that his victim is studying him and just waiting for the perfect moment. But Li would go on to abduct Duan. She was a young performer who was working part-time while she was studying. And of course, this young woman, in the very beginning, she fights, she screams, she kicks, she scratches, she does whatever she could. But as soon as she enters that bunker, she realises that she is in this sick operational system. Now, as I said, they all had separate chambers, so she was put in a completely separate chamber from Zhang. But these women, they still found their ways to communicate, even if it was short bursts. Sometimes they would whisper through the gaps when they had the opportunity. They would try and write words on the floor at perfect moments. And Duan also studied this loser, because these women, they're now strategizing, they're now trying to find their way out, and they're working together. She noticed the thing about Li was he loved to brag. He would constantly boast. It was his bad habit. He would boast about his abduction tactics, his routines, even his work hours. This was a kind of loser that loves the sound of his own voice and his own authority. Because finally, in his head at least, he believes that he has women listening, women obeying. He's not realising that his captives want him to keep talking because they are storing every single detail. Soon after Li Hao, he would abduct a young woman by the name of Jiayang. This was a young, soft-spoken woman who was just working in a service job when this idiot targeted her. When her abduction had taken place, she fiercely resisted. I mean, she put up one hell of a fight to the point where she almost got away. But Li Hao was able to overpower her, but you could see the struggle that she had went through, because by the time he gets her into this bunker, when he throws her to the ground, she is already beaten and bruised in ways that the other woman hadn't been. And initially, when she gets into that bunker, she's shattered, she's broken, she's trembling, she is terrified. She was completely overwhelmed, but somehow this young woman, she is able to build up her strength. She gathers all her bravery, all her courage, and she eventually becomes the heart of this group, the heart that holds everyone together. She would help steady the others, she helped them maintain clarity, and she listened intently every single time that Li Hao would start on one of his rants. And she started to pick up on things that the other women hadn't yet, things that they hadn't noticed. One major factor was the fact that Li Hao, he only ever double locked that door when he was angry. She also recognised just how badly this man craved validation. It was very clear to her that when he felt like he was in control, when he felt as though his captives were obeying him, he relaxed, because he feels like he's fully in control. But what he didn't realise is when he relaxed, it made it dangerous for him and essential for these women, because this man's greatest weakness had been exposed. It wasn't a physical weakness, it was an emotional one. Now, once Li Hao has these 4 women in his captivity, he starts having them on this rotating basis. So one woman would be filming, the other woman would be coerced into sex work. Others would be kept in periods of deprivation of food and water, something that was meant to keep them dependent. This man did control everything in a sense. He controlled their food, their bedding, their air, even their sleep cycles. And because this loser just loves the sound of his own voice, he would often give them lectures about how they were being reborn underground, that he was giving them structure that they should be thankful of. He thought that he was showing even more control, even more domination, the more women that he abducted. But what he didn't realise, because let's be honest, he is one dumb motherfucker, because every single new captive that he brought in meant that these women were no longer isolated. It meant that these women were banding together. These women were building strategy. They would compare his routines whenever they were left alone. They became unified without ever being in the same room at the same time. Now, when Li had kidnapped Sai, a young teenager, the dynamic within that bunker, it would change again. She was so young, she was so vulnerable, she was confused as to why this horrific thing was happening to her. Why was she a target? Why was she now a victim? And she was eager to comply at first because she thought that would guarantee her safety. While she is confused, while she is terrified, while she is desperate for survival, again, she brings something else to that group, because she notices something with the ventilation system, and that was that it was never fully sealed. She had said that during certain hours when the noise outside had aligned just right, she could hear faint voices, she could hear scooters going by, she could hear traffic, even voices. And that meant that there was at least one structural flaw in his otherwise airtight fantasy. She had also told the other captives who had been held there longer that she noticed at one point the door wasn't latched fully, and this would be a detail that was crucial to them later. Finally, we have the 6th victim. That is a young girl by the name of Ma. She was the youngest and most fragile of them all. She had slipped into the city's nightlife illegally. She was seeking work to try and support herself. When she entered that chamber, she looked as though she was paralysed with fear. She was shaking constantly, she could barely calm down, and the other captives, they became so fiercely protective of her. They would speak to her gently, they would guide her, they would offer her reassurance whenever she needed it. And in her own way, as time goes on, she is also able to contribute to the observations of these women. She was able to contribute crucial details. She had noticed just how long the upstairs light would stay on before Li Hao would make his way downstairs into that bunker. This told her that he was either cooking, cleaning, or pacing. And these kind of details, they were crucial to the women because it revealed his kind of emotional state at that point. Was he relaxed or was he pacing? Was he agitated? Was something going on? They were trying to pinpoint when he was most vulnerable. She also noticed that sometimes he left the upper door unlatched for several minutes, especially when he was juggling multiple tasks. Like every other woman in this chamber, she was watching him with the same hypervigilance that their life depended on. And together, these captives, they piece him from the ground up. They build up his profile. They catalogued every single inconsistency. Inconsistencies that he believed they couldn't see, that even he wasn't aware of. They were cataloguing his neediness, his disorganisation, his inability to maintain routine, his emotional volatility, because he was up and down like a freaking yo-yo. Every single one of them had noticed his outward overconfidence, his bragging ability. They also noticed that he would lose track of time, he would misplace keys, he would leave certain doors unlocked or partially locked. This loser at this point believes that he has built a world that he controlled completely. But what he didn't realise is when you build a world on delusion, it's always going to collapse. So these women, obviously, every time they find something out about Li and how he operates, how he thinks, things that he's done, they change the dynamic of this chamber. But the biggest change, the one that was most crucial, this would come when they started to realise that there was a woman before them. So of course we have Zhang, okay, and I'm talking about the second one to arrive, not that first victim who was murdered. But Zhang, when she arrived, she immediately sensed that something was weird. Things weren't adding up because there was an unused chamber. There looked to be fresh bedding that had changed over. There was a patch of soil that Li Hao would always step over or walk around. Not only this, but there was this sweet, sour smell that just didn't belong in that chamber. And as you can probably imagine, Li Hao, who just loves to brag, he loves to give away all his dirty little secrets, he bragged in that smug, self-satisfied way that only a narcissist with a shovel in hand and a god complex could. And he had coldly stated that his first one didn't cooperate, and that meaning was unmistakable to these women. They knew exactly what that meant. But potentially the most disturbing moment for these women would come when a second murder would take place. And this would be one that would completely rewire any survivors in this chamber. Now, this was a young woman who had been abducted after Zhang, and unfortunately, due to the privacy laws, I'm not entirely sure which one of the women it was that would become this victim because different sources say different things. But what we do know for sure is that one of these young women would be murdered. This was one of the young women that had fought so bravely during the abduction, who had fought once she was brought into the chamber, who would scream until her voice shredded into pieces. Apparently, she had continued to defy every wish of Li Hao, something that he hated, something that made him feel humiliated, and something he had to get control over. Because what if all these other women started to think that they could defy him and get away with it? He had to show them that this wasn't the case. So he's trying to force her to make these recordings. He is beating her. He is starving her. She spits in his face and he gets even more humiliated. And Li Hao hated this because this was the kind of woman that terrified him. Someone whose inner core could not be broken. Whose hatred for him was far stronger than any fear she had. And because he was too much of a coward to carry out this murder himself this time, he forced two other of these captives to murder this young woman. He forced them to take blunt objects. They were then thrown into this woman's cell with her, and when they failed to comply, he threatened them with violence. He threatened to murder them alongside this young woman. They were ordered to beat this already weak woman to death. And these two women, they had to obey, and it wasn't out of malice, it was out of complete survival. They knew what awaited them if they didn't. When this brutal killing was complete, these women were shattered. They hated themselves for what they had done. They couldn't believe that they've participated in something like this, but they were forced. Their hands were tied. Now, after this, they were forced to clean up the scene. They were forced to help Li Hao bury this young woman. He threatened them that if they cried or if they hesitated whilst doing this, they would find themselves in that pit with her, and they had to bury this woman the same way that he had buried the first. Packed underneath fresh soil, discarded like she was nothing, like she was trash. And after this was all done, he locked the women back up in their chambers, left them to try and pick up the pieces of them that had been shattered. And he went up the stairs and made himself a frickin' cup of tea, sat down, put his feet up in his chair, drank tea after murdering and forcing two other victims to murder one of the captives. He treated this like it was just another household task, something that he had to complete, and now he could relax that it was done. And like I said, this second murder, it changed everything in that bunker. Now, Li Hao, he thought by forcing these women to participate, by making them accomplices, which, I mean, of course they weren't because they were literally forced into it through fear and survival, but he thought this would silence them forever, that they would never talk about what happened to them. But what he didn't understand, because this man was incapable of any insight unless someone carved it into his frickin' forehead and then showed him it in the mirror, but he had just shattered any illusion that obedience would keep these women alive. Because until that moment, these captives, they thought that compliance might buy them time, it might buy them mercy. But after this murder, they understood that the only way out of this was to outthink him entirely. His attempt to deepen that control had only unified them stronger against him. So at this point, it's become very obvious to the woman that Li Hao, he has stretched himself far too thin, and he is not a good multitasker. Like when he was prepping one of the women for a client, that meant that he was leaving another unattended for several minutes. Sometimes when he was filming one of the girls, he would leave objects unattended in the other room, like keys and things that are important to keep his captives captive. Whenever he was having to clean up after his own violent streak, this also meant that he was leaving chambers unlocked whilst he did so. His attempts to manage multiple women really showed the limits of his capacity. And although he built multiple chambers, it was clear that his system was not built to contain multiple women. Every additional captive required more effort, and this was just like effort that he didn't have to give. And the women at this point, although they had already been aware of this previously, it became more important to them how Li responded to tone. If they challenge him, he's unpredictable. But if they appeared calm, collected, neutral, he settled into a rhythm. And this made him easier to track because they knew how to behave to stabilise a mood, to stop him from escalating. Now, Zhang and Duan, they were the first amongst the women to start cultivating a plan. They had been there the longest, they had watched over this man the longest, learned his rhythms, his patterns, or lack thereof. They knew which parts of his behaviour was predictable and what other parts were inconsistent. They noticed that he would follow the same basic pattern every evening when he was preparing for a client coming. He would be upstairs for a long time, he was cleaning, he was prepping the area, and this meant for them that he was away from the bunker longer. And not only that, he was very distracted. They had also noticed that the forced sex work appointments, these happened on the same days every week, and a lot of the time this would take place late at night. And Li Hao always appeared to be very anxious, very on edge before these appointments took place. And his anxiety was something that made him very careless. Now, these women, in these moments of opportunity, they were counting hinges, trying to see which hinges squeaked, which didn't. They were looking at the cracks in the corners, the vibrations from up above. They were seeing what screws were loose, which doors opened easier, which frames were weaker. They learned how long it took him to walk from the top of the stairs to the bottom of the stairs. He'd also realised that he would forget which woman was locked in which bunker at any given time when he was exhausted. And they learned that the upstairs door, sometimes this failed to latch fully. They'd also realised that Li Hao, he was overconfident because he didn't imagine that the captive women were studying him. He didn't believe that these women were capable of strategy. But he was so wrong. He was understanding them, understanding their silence for submission, when really it was concentration. He misunderstood their stillness as fear when really that was calculation. And he, above all, misunderstood the impact that those murders had. He believed that he had broken every single one of the women, but in reality, he had just removed that last illusion that compliance might just keep them alive. It was during these months of quiet study that the women were sort of planning out the perfect moments to escape. They knew it wouldn't be quick, they knew it wouldn't be easy, and every single one of these women had discussed the fact that they didn't believe every single one of them would make it out alive. But that didn't matter to them, because at least if some of them could, they could get justice for the others. Like, that part makes me so emotional, because these women, they were really risking their lives. They didn't care if they made it out, they just wanted someone to make it out and make people aware of what was happening here. The understanding amongst them had shifted over time, and they realised wherever there was an opportunity, whoever had that opportunity, it had to be taken, and that person had to take it, even if it meant leaving the others behind. Now, outside, the world had also started noticing young women disappearing. Friends of Jiang had realised that she stopped turning up for shifts. People were saying that she's probably just left or moved away, but her friends didn't buy it. And it was clear that Li Hao, he thought he was targeting the most vulnerable women, the ones that no one would come looking for, but what he didn't realise is he had abducted women all from the same social circle, the same work environment. It was clear that they were disappearing, and people were eager to find out why. So, days go by and Lee returns to the house, and the women immediately notice there is something different about him. His footsteps upstairs appeared rushed, and usually this meant he had a temper. Something had pissed him off somehow. And this emotional state that he would get in, it almost always affected his diligence, how he would check locks, how he would check doors. He usually became quite lax. Now, when he descended into the bunker, he only half secured the upper door. He had then moved two of the captive women whilst he was distracted, and this distraction caused him to leave one of the interior doors unlocked. And these women, they knew, do not react, do not draw attention to this, just be as you always are, be calm, be neutral, do not give him reason to suspect anything. And every single one of them were so aware of the sounds around them that that sound was unmistakable. That lock had not engaged. So when he returns upstairs, the women, they are listening intently, they are paying attention. They hear the kettle go on. This usually means that he's gonna relax, he's gonna settle for a bit. So the kettle starts to boil and they hear something being slammed down, which in their minds must be a cup. You know, he's making a tea, obviously. And the woman knew that what this meant is that he wasn't going to be coming back down the stairs. Not for a while. And this is the moment that Shang decided she was going to move. She pushed the door and she felt it give. She then motioned to Duan, who silently joined her. The pair of them, they're able to slip out into the adjoining corridor and they stop. They listen. Because they have learned this man's every move, every step, every sound. They know what it is, they know what he's doing. And so they listen for it. It was clear that he was still occupied upstairs, that he hadn't heard anything. So they whisper to the other women whose chambers are still locked. They promise him that if they get help, they will ensure that they come back and save them. And the women trusted it. This was their plan all along. They would do whatever they could to save each other. So as they climb up the stairs, they see the second door. Now, this second door, like I said, it wasn't locked, but it also wasn't fully unlocked. It hadn't been latched correctly. So there's a chance now it might squeak, it might make a bit of noise when the women try to open it. But at this point, they're willing to take any chance they have to. So they start to unlock the door. And thankfully, it doesn't make a sound. They then step out onto the top floor of that house. For the first time in months, and for some even in years, this was the first time they had been in a room that didn't have concrete walls and bars for doors. The only issue that they had, though, is that the entire house was silent, bar from that kettle boiling. As they moved toward the front door of the house, seeing that glimpse of freedom, they realised that the door had been bolted. This didn't mean by any means that their plan was over, it just meant that they had to move stealthily now more than ever. But as these women try to unfasten this lock, there's a sound from the kitchen. And that sound is the kettle clicking off. It had finished boiling. That little bit of cover they had, that sound was now gone. Footsteps then start approaching. This was obviously Lee going to go and make his cup of tea or whatever the frick he was drinking. But the women got scared. They're looking around, seeing if there's a place where they can hide, and they panic because there's nowhere. They can only stand at this door. But they take a moment, they have to try and calm themselves down. They realise they're likely not going to get out that door. So Zhang, she runs over to the window. Now, the window has bars covering it, but she could push this window open and fit her arm through. And that's exactly what she does. In desperation, she starts waving her arm around outside, getting the attention of a woman who is passing by. When she knows that that woman has seen her, she starts shouting for help. She begs the woman to get help, bring it back to the house. And this woman takes off. She is going to go and get help. But by this point, Li has spotted Duan and Zhang, and they are dragged back down into that bunker. When he drags the woman back down, he is panicked, he is frantic, he is freaking out because he is feeling the walls close in on him. Moments later, there's banging at the front door. That woman had ran away, got 2 others, and returned. They're frantically banging, they're shouting, they are trying to get this man's attention. They want to see what is going on in here. But he keeps ignoring the door. Now, devastatingly, the people at the door, they did eventually go away. I mean, they're not getting any answer. This might have been like a young child who was acting out. They didn't know for sure what was happening behind that door. And so they never got help. But the thing is, knowing that they could get to the top of that house, knowing that they had brought some kind of attention to the situation, it gave the women hope. A hope that they hadn't felt ever. And it created fear in Li Hao. For the next several days, Li barely slept. He was pacing the floors, he was constantly checking the windows, just wondering when the police were going to show up. He would also come down to the chamber more frequently. And this wasn't to feed the women or, get them participating in any of his sick, depraved acts. It was simply to stare at them, try to intimidate them one last time, but this man is losing all power at this point. They had already outsmarted him once, and they were just waiting to do it again. And the thing is, the woman had obviously noticed before that fear or panic had made him sloppy. Now it's made him frantic, and he's over-checking. He's checking the restraints multiple times. He's fumbling with the keys because he's all jangled. He was snapping at them when they hadn't even said anything at all. They had barely even breathed, but everything was becoming too much for him. And this new fear that had been instilled in Li Hao, it made him unpredictable. And unpredictable meant mistakes. The women didn't know what kind of mistake was going to happen, but they knew that one was coming. They didn't know when, but they were patient. The second opportunity for escape, this would come when Li was taking Ma to one of our forced filming sessions. Now, he's exhausted at this point, he's still barely sleeping, and he is living in constant fear. So when they're doing this filming session, he's directing it really shoddily. Like, he forgets what lines he wants her to say, the camera's not steady, he can't get the frame proper. Like, it's just clear this man is losing control of everything. So the session ends and Leah's taking Ma back to her chamber because, he's tired. He needs his rest. He needs his beauty sleep that clearly doesn't work for him. Now, when he takes her back to the chamber, he makes a grave mistake that he's made before. He didn't secure the latch. He had closed the door, but he had closed it too hard in his agitation that the lock didn't catch. And he never checked it this time because he was too tired. And again, the women, they don't move immediately. They're holding still. They are being cool, calm, and collected. They wait for him to get upstairs. They hear the unmistakable sound of this loser collapsing into his chair. And this is when Ma would make her move. She slipped away from her chamber. She went straight to Duan. However, Duan this time, she was completely locked in. There was no way of taking her with her. Ma was going to have to try and do this all by herself. So Ma would make her way upstairs just as before. She listens for footsteps. She listens for any noise that might signal that this monster is coming. When she reaches the main level of the house, she notices the greatest mistake that Li Hao could ever have made. That front door wasn't locked. It wasn't bolted. All she had to do was get to that door and she could escape. And that's exactly what she did. Quietly and stealthily, she made her way toward that door. She opened it and she sprinted into the night. She's barefoot, she is starved, she is dehydrated, she can barely hold herself up, but she has sheer determination. And that carries her far enough that she bumps into a woman. This woman can see that Ma is clearly filthy. She is dirty. She has bruises. It's clear that she is being starved. And Ma is begging her for help. This woman, she runs and she gets others. She brings Ma water, and these men all gather around to protect Ma. They call the police and they surround her to ensure that she cannot be dragged back. But before the police could arrive, Li Hao would appear. He had realised eventually that the bunker door hadn't latched, and he realised that one woman had made an escape. And so he sprinted out into the night in a complete panic, determined to bring her back, hoping and praying that she hadn't found help. But she had. When he sees Ma with these strangers, he lunges towards her. There is men stepping in, women stepping in, but Li, he has pure adrenaline. He has pure fear and anger. He starts dragging Ma back toward that house, and he is so strong at this point, he is able to shove her in and lock the door. Once he has locked the door, he would take Ma back down to that chamber, and the recapture of this woman was brutal. He was beaten her in ways that he had never beat her before. He was depraved, and you could tell that nothing was going to stop him this time. However, he's sloppy, he's tired, he's a bit disorientated, and he makes a very strange decision, and that is to leave the house again. I don't know if he had a moment of thinking that he would be better to run, or whether he just wasn't thinking at all because he's a complete idiot, but by the time he returns back to this house, the police were already there. Now he panics. He's trying to say to these police, like, I have no idea what you're on about, officer. I don't know what's going on. There's a bunker in my house with women? What? I didn't put them there. Someone must be in my house illegally capturing these women. But the police, the minute they talk to the survivors, they have so much detail. They are able to tell them everything, and what they couldn't tell them, their injuries spoke for themselves. Li Hao at this point, he doesn't resist arrest, he just collapses into it. After all, he's tired. Now the young women, the captives who remained in this chamber, they were being pulled out one by one. Every single one of them, as they were being pulled out by the police, they were apologising. They were apologising that they smelled, that they looked bad, that they couldn't walk by themselves, that they couldn't hold themselves up. One of the survivors asked if she was in trouble. Another one kept repeating, please, please don't let him come back. They had been underground for so long that other people, even the daylight, felt hostile to them. Now, once the chamber area was cleared, the police, they started to photograph everything. The evidence was overwhelming, and it became very clear exactly what these women had been through. They had found the recording equipment, the memory cards that stored these horrific videos. There was clothing that quite clearly did not belong to Li Hao. They had found receipts, discarded restraints. They found victims' belongings, and underneath packed soil, they found the bodies of 2 victims. The minute that Li Hao was brought into custody, he stopped being this tyrant that he had always pretended to be, and he reverted back to exactly what he had been beneath that fantasy. And that was a weak little man who relied on secrecy to feel powerful. During his interrogation, he tries to minimise everything that happened. He said that the rapes were all consensual, that they weren't coerced into sex work, and that they had agreed to be filmed. He even stated that the deaths of those 2 women were accidental. Explain that accident to me, Lee, because how the hell does that happen? But it only took investigators less than half of that interview to completely dismantle his lies. The evidence, and in particular the filmed material, that left no room for speculation. That told the story. As you can imagine, the women's questioning in interviews was absolute harrowing. They had to describe the months or over a year of torture that they had endured, the constant rape, the constant coercion into forced sex work, the murders that they had witnessed or that they had to endure, the terror that they lived with every day, thinking that they possibly might be next. These women might have been quiet, they might have been terrified and broken to a certain extent, but they spoke with absolute clarity. They had maintained those details that they had catalogued over all that time. The hardest part of the interviews for the police was the two women that had to detail what happened during that murder that they were forced to participate in. The investigators quickly realised that these women had to operate under extreme duress. Their own lives had been at immediate risk, and still the legal process, that would treat them very different later. Now, when the case was referred to prosecutors, the charges were comprehensive. I mean, Lee was going to face multiple different charges. There was rape, murder, coercion into prostitution, trafficking, illegal detention, and production of obscene materials. And like I said, the evidence against this weirdo was so overwhelming that this case was practically a slam dunk. But for these women, for the survivors and the horrors that they endured, the court proceedings wouldn't be so simple. Because under Chinese law at this time, involvement in a homicide, even under coercion, required legal examination. The two women who were forced to participate in this murder, they were initially treated as accomplices. And the idea that these victims who had been threatened, raped, tortured, starved, psychologically broken and controlled for that period of time, the fact that they could be held responsible shocked so many people of the public. And the prosecution, they eventually acknowledged the coercion. But the legal classification of this, it still remained complicated. And these two women, they were facing 3 years in prison. They would be convicted and imprisoned for this period of time. And the other surviving women, they were put on probation. What does that tell survivors and victims? Where is the justice? The other layer of trauma that this would add to them is unimaginable. Have they not suffered enough? Their role in this entire thing had been survival, not agency. But the law would only see the act before it's seen the context. Li Hao, thankfully, would be sentenced to death. And of course, as you can imagine, he would show very little emotion when that verdict was read. In his final statement, he tried to say that he was a misunderstood man who never intended for things to escalate. Yeah, but spending a year building an underground chamber with restraints and chains and bars kind of tells a different story. You pathetic scumbag. After the trial, the surviving women, they made the decision to disappear from the public. They wanted to protect themselves, shield their families, and try to recover and repair their lives by themselves. What is known is that most, if not all of these women had to undergo medical care not only for their physical injuries, but the mental scars that this whole thing left behind. The youngest survivor would struggle the most. Entering that chamber as a young teenager, it caused a fracture in her development. The other women, they would have trauma therapy for years, some grappling with the guilt from the actions that they were coerced into. Now, thankfully, on January the 21st of 2014, Li Hao, he would be executed. The bunker would be destroyed and that house would be emptied. And the world would move on. But for those women who endured that trauma, who endured that suffering, they carry a lifetime of repair ahead of them. His execution would never erase their trauma, but it did mean that he would never decide ever again who lived or who died. His story ended the way that every single story like his should, with finality, accountability, and the impossibility of return. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I hope this one was interesting for you. Hopefully it was a new case for you today, but if it wasn't, hopefully, possibly, I've given you some more details that you didn't know, hopefully. If you do enjoy my content, please, please, please do not forget to like, comment and subscribe. Get the notification bell on so you don't miss when I upload. It would mean the world to me if you could please hype this video up. My last video had the hype option. Don't know what happened there, but what I will tell you is Daddy YT, the platform that we're on, they're against me. I'm telling you, they are against me. I don't know why. I don't know what I've done to upset them. I think it might be because I don't censor the words that I say, but I just think we shouldn't have to. I just feel like the victims of these stories deserve more than that. We shouldn't have to censor what they've been through. That was their real life. That's what they had to endure. They couldn't censor that moment when they were in it. They had to live it. And if we have to be uncomfortable for an hour or so whilst we tell their stories, it's the least that they deserve. Don't forget any details you need regarding me, myself, and I. They will all be found listed down below. I'm going to include my social media handles, my Instagram and my TikTok. I would highly suggest that you give me a follow over there because I am going to start posting on a weekly basis. Maybe every couple of days at some point, once I can get the full-time job out the way, which is literally killing my soul right now. If you could share this video or even just share my name with someone else that you know that is really interested in true crime, maybe they like makeup, that would mean the entire world to me as well. But I think I've said everything that I need to say. So on that note, please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe. Look after each other. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!